Okay, so we're going to continue the discussion from last class today. We're going to talk about passing genes to the next generation, part 2. Here we go. So yesterday, we covered asexual reproduction, which is one individual creating a genetically identical clone of itself to pass on its genes to its offspring. Today, however, we're going to cover sexual reproduction, which is where there's two parents combining genetic information to their offspring. And we're going to look at this in plants, animals, and bacteria. Now, just a bit of a disclaimer here. This isn't a health class. Of course, this is a science class. So the focus on this in Science 9 is to understand that sexual reproduction creates genetic diversity within a species, whereas asexual reproduction does not. In other words, if you look around and look at the people that you know, you're going to notice that there's a lot of differences between members of our own species. And you can say that with any animal, you can say that with any plant, at least any of those that, operate off of sexual reproduction, right? It's because there's genetic information that is shared amongst a species, which creates genetic diversity. In other words, it creates a bunch of different possibilities within one species. This is going to explain why that exists. Let's get started. So just before we begin, there's some terminology that you need to kind of wrap your head around. These terms are going to come around a lot today, so you will need to understand what they mean. All types of sexual reproduction require gametes, zygotes, and fertilization. So gametes are either the male or female cell involved in sexual reproduction. So it's just one or the other, right? That's a gamete. Now a zygote is the united pair of a male gamete and a female gamete. So when these two gametes combine together, they form something called a zygote. Now fertilization is the creation of a zygote. So fertilization is the process by which two gametes combine to create a zygote. So we need to be familiar with all three of those terms before we move on. So now we'll talk about it in plants. Most plants actually produce both male and female gametes, but only some only produce male or female gametes. So in other words, most plants you look at actually have a male and a female component to them. Some only have one or the other, but for the majority of plants, they do actually have both. Now pollen, the stuff that gives you like allergies, of course, in the spring, is found on the stamen in a plant, which if you look at this picture here, the stamen is this part, of course, and that contains the male gametes, right? So pollen is the male component of a plant. Now ovules, which are found in the pistil, which is not even in this picture here. Well, really, I guess this whole thing right here is the pistil. I'm sorry, it wasn't even labeled in the picture. Those contain the female gametes, right? So again, just to review this real quick, pollen is the male component, and ovules, which are like inside the plant here, that's the female component, right? At least for the one or those plants that, of course, have both male and female parts. Now, for plants that produce both male and female gametes, they can actually self-pollinate. In other words, they can pollinate themselves, of course. While this produces genetically identical offspring, it's actually still considered a form of sexual reproduction in plants. And this is because a male and a female gamete are joining, right? So even though it's one plant creating offspring, which from yesterday's definition would have counted as asexual reproduction, it actually is considered sexual reproduction because it's a male and a female gamete joining. Now, otherwise, there's cross-pollination, which is, of course, what you've probably heard from most other situations. Totally look clear. I just cross it out. You know what? I'm going to do that better. There we go. That's better. That's better underlined. So cross-pollination, of course, is where the pollen from one plant is carried to another plant. So let me ask you this, and you can pause if you need to. How does this happen? How does pollen from one plant get transferred to the ovule of another plant? Well, I think a lot of us probably already know this. There's actually biotic factors. I'll actually write that down. There's biotic factors. Biotic meaning, of course, living things. And there's abiotic factors, which means non-living things. Biotic factors are probably what you think of most of the time when you think about plants pollinating, right? Those are things like insects, which of course would include bees. Bees are a very essential part of pollinating plants, but certain kind of birds as well, like hummingbirds are actually known to do that. Those would be things that, of course, would pollinate. And of course, humans can also do this as well if you manually pollinate two different plants, as a lot of people in that field of study may do. Now, abiotic factors, so non-living things, would include the wind, which can carry pollen around. Of course, in the springtime, when you have allergies really bad, that's because pollen is blowing through the air, and that pollen from the wind, which is a non-living factor, can be transferred to another plant. But also water can do this as well. It really depends, of course, on the type of plant, but of course, rain can spread pollen around, and then that pollen, which gets caught up in water particles from the rain, can be transferred to another plant and actually pollinated. So there are biotic and abiotic factors behind plants pollinating themselves. Now for the process in plants, I've broken it down into 4 really quick steps. It's, in my opinion, pretty self-explanatory for the most part, but there's some things in here that you might be a little surprised with. First of all, the process in plants is the pollen grains, which again is the male gamete, are brought to the ovules, the female gamete, in the ovaries in the plant, right? That we already have covered. Part 2 is a zygote. Remember, that's 2 different gametes that have joined together, of course. The zygote is formed and contains the genetic information from both parents. Part 3 is it then goes through many cell divisions. So think back to binary fission, which we learned last class, to form a multicellular embryo containing a miniature leaf, root, and a stem. So an embryo, of course, is basically like the baby plant, right? It's the plant that's starting to develop after it has been become a zygote and has been pollinated and going from there, right? Now, the embryo is protected by a seed and can stay dormant for a long time. So in other words, like the seeds that you would buy, that you'd go and plant in your garden or whatever, those are already, of course, pollinated seeds. They formed, of course, from a zygote. They're now a multicellular embryo, and they stay dormant. In other words, they are not active anymore for a long time. That's why you can buy seeds that have been in a package for like a long time and then plant them in the ground and they still will grow a new plant. It's because they've just remained dormant until conditions are appropriate for them developing into a full plant. All right, so now we're going to move on to animals. We're not going to spend too much time on this because it's, believe it or not, very similar to how it works in plants, which may sound quite surprising, of course, but it is. So with animals, it also involves a male gamete, which in animals we refer to as being a sperm cell, combining with a female gamete, which is an egg cell. And this still creates a zygote. Again, a zygote is, of course, a male gamete and a female gamete that have joined together. Now, fertilization in animals occurs either internally or externally, so either inside the animal or outside the animal. Internal, of course, occurs in insects, reptiles, birds, mammals, etc. Now, the reason that there's 2 different forms here, internal and external, it's just an adaptation based on what their environments are. For internal, it has a higher rate of success because the eggs are actually protected by the mother. Now, external occurs in most worms, in fish, and in amphibians. And this has a lower rate of success since the eggs are exposed to weather and predators. But the reason that external exists in worms, fish, and amphibians is, of course, that you can lay a lot more eggs and can pollinate a lot more, or fertilize rather, a lot faster, right? So there are benefits to both. Anyway, moving on. Now we'll talk quickly about bacteria as well. You might remember from last class that I said most bacteria reproduce asexually, but there are actual bacteria that can have sexual reproduction as well. Now, this method that they use is called bacterial conjugation. Basically, all it is a connection forms between 2 bacteria, as you can see in this picture, and genetic material is transferred directly from one cell to the other. The cell that receives that genetic information will then go through binary fission, which we learned yesterday is a form of asexual reproduction, to create more cells. It's just the only thing that's different here now is that that cell that's now dividing has new genetic information. Kind of a silly way to think about this is imagine like this cell, let's say, is receiving. So I'll just put an R here. That's the one that's receiving the genetic information. So the genetic information is being passed from the large one to the small one, just for example. I can't tell from this picture which way it's going. It's arbitrary. Just bear with me on this one. But let's say that this cell is receiving the genetic information. Basically, a silly way of thinking about this is it's like this cell is receiving like extra code from this one. Like it's like getting like an update or something, right? So it's got new genetic information, which might contain new adaptations or new resistance to certain viruses, for instance. And basically, it has a little bit of new information attached to it. So then once it starts doing division, it's creating more cells that actually have that new genetic information to it, which is kind of cool, actually. So we're just going to talk about some advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So asexual, the reason that this has advantages, so the reason some things do this, is an advantage would be you only need one organism, right? So imagine like worst case scenario within a species, every other member of the species was gone and there was only one member left. Well, you would certainly hope that that one member is capable of doing this, because then it can propagate the species and keep it going. Another advantage is it doesn't require any specialized cells to bring gametes together, and not requiring specialized cells means it's going to be using less energy, right? Another advantage is it can produce lots very quickly, right? So in other words, with binary fission or with budding or any of the other ways we looked at this, you can actually produce a lot more copies a lot quicker, generally speaking. Now, some disadvantages, however, are if conditions are unfavorable, the entire population could be wiped out. Just to elaborate on this, if every single member of a certain species had the same DNA, then they would be susceptible to the same weaknesses that that original parent had. So for example, if an individual was susceptible to a certain disease, then all of the clones made by that individual would be susceptible to it as well. So in other words, you're not getting any benefits of having different kinds of genetic information to protect you from certain conditions. So basically, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to say, right? You're just saying, all right, this is the member of the population that's going to be really the genetic code for everyone else. And if there's any problems with that genetic code, well, then everyone else has those problems as well. Now, as for sexual reproduction, of course, I've only listed one advantage, but the main advantage is a huge one, like it's not to be underestimated at all, is it provides lots of genetic variation, or in other words, genetic diversity, which helps species survive environmental change. With species that perform sexual reproduction, there's tons of different adaptations and tons of different variations that exist within that species. Even just think about humans, right? People have different hair color, different eye color, different skin color, different body types. Some people are more likely to get certain diseases than other people, but other people are more resistant to those things. There's a lot of variation that occurs within people, as well as within most plants and most animals, right? So that is a huge advantage to this. It provides a lot of different variation with genetic material, which can protect the whole species as a whole. Now, some disadvantages are that two partners are needed, which for like species where there's tons of members of the certain species, that's not a problem, but this makes it more difficult for endangered species, right? Because with endangered species, a member of that species might be using a lot of time and a lot of energy just to find another member of its own species, right? So that's a big disadvantage there. Another disadvantage is it takes more energy than asexual reproduction. And then the last one would be it only produces a limited amount of offspring, generally speaking, right? You could argue with fish, of course, which lay like thousands of eggs, that might be a bit of a moot point, but keep in mind, generally speaking, it does produce limited offspring, right? At least compared to asexual reproduction. Anyway, that's it for today. That was a pretty quick lesson. We're just over like 13 or so minutes, I think. So for practice, I want you to try page 36, questions 1, 2, 4, 7, 9, and 11. I know I'm kind of bouncing around there, but there was a lot of questions in that section that I just thought were kind of redundant or just not necessary. Again, just another reminder, I'm pretty sure at least I've mentioned this before with you guys. I know I've been mentioning it with all my other classes. Check your emails, okay? This is your Grasslands email account. Check it like literally every single day. I've already sent out an email as of Tuesday morning doing a check-in, and I'll probably send another one by Wednesday evening and probably another one Friday morning. I do need to send 3 check-ins every single week, and you need to be responding to those check-ins as well. So please check your emails. That's your Grasslands email account. If you haven't already, you can even hook it to your phone, right? So you can actually hook it up so your phone automatically notifies you when you get an email from your Grasslands account. That would be a really good idea. Anyway, if you have any questions, please send me an email, guys, and best of luck.